You don't belong up here with the rest of us." Those words, hissed by my own sister as she rearranged the bridal party to hide me in the back row, weren't just about a wedding photo. They were the culmination of a lifetime of being made to feel less than, unworthy, and now, apparently, unpresentable. As I stood there in the bridesmaid dress Victoria had specifically chosen to be unflattering on my body type, fighting back tears while her friends snickered, I had no idea that this moment of humiliation would spark a chain of events that would transform not just my life, but an entire community. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but sometimes justice arrives unexpectedly, served by the hand of someone you least suspect. In my case, that hand belonged to my husband Jack, the same man my sister had dismissed as a nobody, unworthy, of a seat at the main table. The man no one knew held the deed to the very ground beneath our feet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as Rachel Morgan meant living in the shadow of my sister Victoria. 3 years older, infinitely more polished and relentlessly ambitious, Vicky had perfected the art of making me feel small without ever letting our mother notice. While I pursued a career in event planning, a profession Victoria deemed playing hostess for people who matter, she climbed the social ranks of Lakeside Harbor, eventually landing Bradley Preston, heir to the Preston Financial fortune and the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties. When Jack Turner entered my life, he was unlike anyone I'd dated before. Quiet, thoughtful, with an understated confidence that didn't demand attention, he'd approached me after an event I'd coordinated for a local tech incubator. "That was remarkably well executed," he'd said, while everyone else was busy networking. "You have a gift for making spaces feel both elegant and welcoming." Such a simple compliment, but it was the first time someone had truly seen the intention behind my work. What I didn't know then was that Jack had been more than just an attendee. What Victoria and her social circle never bothered to discover was that behind his modest demeanor and unremarkable Toyota sedan, my husband ran Horizon Technologies, one of the fastest-growing tech companies on the West Coast. Jack had deliberately kept his success quiet, valuing privacy and genuine connections over the spotlight that wealth inevitably brings. "Are you sure you want me there?" Jack had asked when Victoria's wedding invitation arrived, addressed only to me with no +1 option. "Your sister has made it fairly clear I'm not on her approved list." "You're my husband," I'd replied with a conviction I didn't entirely feel. "Of course you should be there." That conviction wavered considerably when, 3 days before the wedding, Victoria called with slight adjustments to the arrangements. "Rachel, darling," she'd begun, her voice dripping with the false sweetness she reserved for delivering unpleasant news. "I've had to make some necessary changes to the seating chart. The Prestons have so many important connections attending, and Bradley needs to place them strategically." I knew what was coming before she said it. "You'll need to tell Jack we simply don't have room for him at the family table. He'll be seated with the colleagues from my office. It's actually a better fit, don't you think? They can talk about whatever it is he does." My stomach had tightened. "He's my husband, Vicky. He should be seated with me." "Don't be difficult, Rachel. You're in the bridal party anyway, so you'll barely be sitting. This is about Bradley's future, our future. I need every advantage at this wedding, and having your unconnected husband at the main table doesn't help our image." I'd swallowed my protest, as I'd done countless times before. Jack had merely shrugged when I'd told him, his calm acceptance making me feel even worse about my inability to stand up to my sister. The Westbrook estate looked like something from a fairy tale on the morning of Victoria's wedding. Built in the 1920s by a shipping magnate, its manicured gardens sloped gently down to the harbor, offering picture-perfect views of the lighthouse and marina. I'd arrived early as instructed, joining the other bridesmaids in the estate's east wing where a small army of stylists was creating Victoria's vision of perfection. "Rachel, "You're finally here," Victoria said, not looking up from her phone as I entered the bridal suite. "Your dress is in the back. Megan had to let it out again yesterday." Heather and Danielle, Victoria's friends since college, exchanged glances that didn't try to hide their amusement. I felt the familiar flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. "I tried it on last week," I said quietly. "It fit fine then." "Well, it didn't look fine," Victoria replied, finally looking up to assess me critically. "The alterations will help, though there's only so much fabric to work with." I retreated to the adjoining room where Megan Walsh, Victoria's wedding planner, gave me a sympathetic smile as she handed me the garment bag. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I told her the dress fit perfectly before." The emerald green satin, a color that made my skin look sallow, had indeed been altered, but not in the way Victoria had implied. The waist had been taken in, not let out, making what had been a snug fit now nearly impossible to zip. "I can't breathe in this," I gasped as Megan struggled with the zipper. "That's not right," Megan frowned. "It fit you perfectly at the final fitting." A text lit up my phone on the vanity. "Everything okay? Let me know if you need a rescue. Jack." The simple message, a lifeline of support in the midst of Victoria's orchestrated humiliation, steadied me. Jack and I had developed a rescue signal early in our relationship for uncomfortable social situations. 3 quick texts of any emoji meant, "Extract me now." I'd never needed it more than today, but something kept me from sending it. Perhaps pride, or the lingering hope that just once I could earn Victoria's approval. "I can make this work," I told Megan, taking a deep breath as she finally managed to close the zipper. "Let's just get through today." What I didn't know then was that Victoria's manipulations extended far beyond an ill-fitting dress. As the bridal party assembled for photos in the estate's rose garden, I overheard Bradley in conversation with an older man I recognized as Walter Griffith, the city's development commissioner. "The zoning changes go through on Monday," Griffith was saying in a low voice. "Once the historical designation is removed, you'll have a clear path for the marina expansion." "Excellent," Bradley replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "The harborside properties are practically falling into our laps already. Amazing what a few targeted building code violations can accomplish." The Harborside district was the historic heart of Lakeside Harbor, a vibrant neighborhood of family-owned businesses and charming old buildings that had somehow resisted the wave of luxury development sweeping through the city. It was also the location of my favorite event venues, authentic spaces with character that corporate hotel ballrooms could never match. "That old Lighthouse Preservation Society is still making noise," Griffith continued. "But they'll fold once. We announced the waterfront revitalization plan. Hard to argue against progress and tax revenue. And nearly impossible once the Preston Foundation makes its donation to the mayor's literacy initiative," Bradley added with a knowing smile. "Everyone has their price." I stood frozen, bouquet clutched in my hands as the conversation confirmed rumors I'd been hearing from venue owners in Harborside. Mysterious building code violations, sudden tax reassessments, and pressure from city officials had been mounting, forcing long-established businesses to consider selling. The Preston Financial Group, it seemed, was orchestrating a coordinated campaign to acquire the waterfront for a massive luxury development. "Rachel!" Victoria's sharp voice cut through my thoughts. "We're waiting for you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Again. I moved mechanically toward the bridal party, my mind racing. Jack had been talking about these issues for months. The vulnerability of harborside businesses, the closed-door dealings at City Hall, the systematic erasure of the city's heritage for profit. As part of his company's community engagement efforts, Horizon Technologies had been offering technical support to small businesses facing pressure to sell. Now it seemed that pressure was coming directly from my soon-to-be brother-in-law. "Let's rearrange," Victoria instructed the photographer, eyeing me critically. "Rachel, move to the back row behind Claudia. The green is washing you out against the roses." As I dutifully stepped back, becoming nearly invisible behind the taller bridesmaids, I caught sight of my mother Eleanor watching from the sidelines. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of concern cross her face, but she quickly averted her eyes when Victoria glanced her way. Since my father's death 5 years ago, Eleanor had increasingly deferred to Victoria's dominant personality, seeking peace at any cost. "Perfect," the photographer called. "Now family only for the next set." Victoria turned to me with a tight smile. "Why don't you check on the reception setup, Rachel? Since event planning is your thing, make yourself useful and make sure the place cards are properly arranged." It wasn't a request, and everyone knew it. As I walked away from the family photos I was apparently not needed in despite. Being the bride's only sister, I felt a familiar hollow ache in my chest. This calculated exclusion was Victoria's specialty, maintaining plausible deniability while making it abundantly clear where I stood in the hierarchy. The grand ballroom of the Westbrook estate was a flurry of activity as florists made final adjustments and servers prepared for the cocktail hour. I stood by the elaborate seating chart display, confirming what Victoria had told me. Jack was seated at table 19, the farthest from the head table, with a collection of Victoria's junior associates from her marketing firm. My place card sat at the head table between my mother and Victoria's college roommate. "Mrs. Turner?" I turned to find Megan, tablet in hand, looking troubled. "Victoria asked me to review the reception timeline with you," she said, then lowered her voice. "But I actually wanted to check if you're okay. I've worked a lot of weddings, and what's happening today isn't normal." The simple acknowledgement from a near stranger that Victoria's behavior was crossing lines brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "I'm fine," I said automatically, then corrected myself. "Actually, I'm not fine, but I'll get through today." Megan glanced over her shoulder before speaking again. "There's something else you should know. I overheard Victoria talking to Bradley this morning about some development deal. Something about Harborside Properties and how they're celebrating. More than just the wedding today." My stomach tightened. "The marina expansion?" Megan nodded. "Bradley has some big announcement planned for the reception. Victoria said it's the real reason they rushed the wedding date, to coincide with some city council approval." The pieces clicked into place. The Harborside district wasn't just another development project. It was the cornerstone of the Preston's expansion plans. And the wedding, this elaborate display of wealth and connection, was doubling as a victory celebration for a deal not yet public. My phone buzzed with a text from Jack. "Just arrived. This place is something else. Heading to the ceremony area." A second text followed immediately. "Also," Marcus called. "The Harborside situation is accelerating. Several owners received eviction notices this morning. On wedding day. Classy timing." Marcus Reed, Jack's business partner, had been helping coordinate support for the Harborside business owners. The timing of the eviction notices couldn't be coincidental. Not on the same day as Bradley's planned announcement. As guests began arriving for the ceremony, I retreated to a quiet alcove and called Jack. "Hey," his warm voice answered immediately. "How's it going in the land of satin and society pages?" "Worse than expected," I admitted. "But that's not why I'm calling. Did Marcus give you details about the eviction notices?" "He did," Jack replied, his tone shifting to concern. "Maria Gonzalez from the Seaside Cafe got one, along with the bookstore and the art gallery. All the properties directly facing the lighthouse. The notices cite unsafe building conditions requiring immediate vacancy. Maria had catered several events I'd planned. Her family restaurant and neighborhood institution for over 40 years. "That's impossible," I said. "Her building passed inspection just last month. I was there when the inspector signed off." "Different inspector this time," Jack said grimly. "Apparently sent directly by the city development office." "By Griffith," I confirmed. I overheard him talking to Bradley. They're rushing the zoning changes through on Monday, and they're using the wedding as cover for some big announcement. Tonight. Jack was silent for a moment. Rachel, I've been trying to tell you for weeks that the Preston Group is behind the harborside pressure, but you didn't want to hear anything negative about Victoria's fiancé. The truth of his words stung. I had dismissed Jack's concerns, making excuses for Bradley's business practices, unwilling to acknowledge that my sister might be marrying someone willing to destroy people's livelihoods for profit. I know, I said quietly. I'm sorry I didn't. Listen, but I'm listening now, and we need to do something. They can't just force these people out of their homes and businesses. Actually, Jack said, his voice taking on a tone I'd rarely heard before, there might be something we can do, but it's complicated, and it would mean... Rachel! Victoria's voice cut through the air as she rounded the corner, still, in her robe, face flushed with anger. What are you doing? The ceremony starts in 20 minutes and you're making phone calls? I have to go, I told Jack quickly. I'll find you after the ceremony. Who was that? Victoria demanded as I ended the call. Please tell me you're not bothering Jack with your insecurities today. This is my day, Rachel. The biggest day of my life. And somehow, you still managed to make things about you. The unfairness of the accusation left me momentarily speechless. I hadn't made anything about me. In fact, I'd spent the entire day being systematically erased from my own sister's wedding. It was a work call, I lied, unwilling to provoke further conflict. One of my clients had an emergency. Victoria rolled her eyes. Of course they did. Your little parties are always having some crisis or another. This is exactly why Bradley says your business isn't sustainable. You're always putting out fires instead of building something with actual value. The casual cruelty, so typical of Victoria's comments about my career, finally ignited something in me. My little parties paid our mother's medical bills last year when your high-value career was too demanding for you to even visit her in the hospital. Victoria's eyes widened at my unexpected backbone, but she recovered quickly. And now you're bringing up ancient history to ruin my wedding day. Typical Rachel drama. She checked her diamond-encrusted watch. We don't have time for this. The photographer needs final bridal party shots before the ceremony. Try not to ruin those too. As she stalked away, I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. Standing up to Victoria, even in this small way, had triggered an automatic fear response. The ingrained anxiety of stepping out of the role she'd assigned me. A text from Sophia, my best friend, appeared on my phone. Just arrived. Jack told me things are tense. Need backup? Sophia Chen, an attorney who specialized in housing rights, had been my steadfast support through years of Victoria's manipulations. She was also one of the few people who knew the truth about Jack's business success, a secret we'd kept at Jack's request as he valued privacy and genuine relationships over the inevitable social climbing his wealth would attract. Just the usual. Victoria special? I replied. But there's more going on with Bradley and Harborside. Can you find Jack during the ceremony? He'll explain. When I rejoined the bridal party, Victoria was resplendent in her custom-designed gown, a cascade of Italian silk and handmade lace that had cost more than my annual rent. She ignored me completely as her friends fussed over her veil, their coordinated gowns a symphony of jewel tones next to my ill-fitting emerald satin. The ceremony proceeded like a perfectly choreographed ballet. Victoria floated down the aisle on our tearful mother's arm to where Bradley waited, the harbor providing a picturesque backdrop to their union. I performed my sisterly duties mechanically, holding the bouquet, adjusting the train, smiling for photographs while my mind raced with what I'd learned about the harborside evictions. During Bradley's vows, promises of honesty and partnership that rang hollow given what I now knew, I scanned the guest seating and found Jack sitting beside Sophia, both of them watching the ceremony with thoughtful expressions. As if sensing My gaze, Jack looked up and gave me a small, reassuring nod. That simple gesture of solidarity amid the pageantry of Victoria's perfect day centered me. Whatever was happening with Harborside, whatever manipulations Victoria had planned for the reception, Jack and I would face it together. What I didn't know then was just how dramatically the evening would unfold, or that Jack's quiet nod contained a promise far beyond mere emotional support. By midnight, the power dynamics of my family would be irrevocably altered, and the fate of an entire community would hang in the balance. As the ceremony concluded with Bradley and Victoria's triumphant kiss, applause erupted from the assembled guests, Lakeside Harbor's elite, politicians, developers, and financial power brokers. I couldn't help but notice that the people whose lives would be most affected by the deals being celebrated were nowhere to be seen. That would change sooner than anyone expected. The cocktail hour began on the terrace overlooking the harbor, with the historic lighthouse visible in the distance, the same lighthouse the Preston development would effectively privatize. I moved through the crowd on autopilot, accepting congratulations, and deflecting questions about when Jack and I might finally start a family. Victoria remained the center of attention, her laugh carrying across the terrace as she introduced Bradley to yet another potential investor. I was making my way toward where I'd last seen Jack when my mother intercepted me, a flute of champagne in each hand. "Rachel, darling," Eleanor said, handing me one of the glasses. "You did beautifully today. Victoria was worried you might cause a scene after that little disagreement earlier." The casual revelation that my sister had been discussing, me behind my back, painting me as the potential problem, was so expected it barely registered. "There's no scene to cause, Mother," I replied, taking a sip of champagne. Victoria got exactly what she wanted, as always. Eleanor's carefully maintained smile faltered. "I know Victoria can be demanding, but this day means everything to her and to our family's standing. The Prestons are incredibly well connected." "Yes, I'm becoming increasingly aware of just how the Prestons use their connections," I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. My mother glanced nervously toward Victoria. "Rachel, please, whatever you're upset about, can it wait until tomorrow? For me?" The plea, so typical of how Eleanor had managed the tension between her daughters for decades, struck a familiar chord of guilt. Keep the peace. Don't rock the boat. Accept your place. "I'm not planning to disrupt anything," I assured her, though the promise felt increasingly difficult to keep given what I knew. "I just need to find Jack." "About that," Eleanor began hesitantly. "Victoria mentioned there was some confusion with the reception seating. I'm sure she didn't mean to separate you from Jack, but with so many important guests." "She absolutely meant to separate us," I corrected gently. "Let's not pretend otherwise. Not today." Eleanor looked stricken, and I immediately regretted my honesty. My mother had spent a lifetime mediating between her daughters, often at the expense of her own peace. "I'm sorry," I said, squeezing her hand. "Today isn't the day for this conversation. Go enjoy Victoria's perfect wedding. I'll be fine." As my mother reluctantly moved away, I finally spotted Jack in conversation with Cameron Preston, Bradley's younger cousin who worked in the family business. Unlike most of the Preston clan, Cameron had always been friendly to me, lacking the calculating assessment that characterized their social interactions. "Rachel," Cameron greeted me with a genuine smile as I approached. "I was just telling Jack about some of the family history on display inside. The Westbrook estate has quite a collection of maritime artifacts, including maps of the original Harborside district," Jack added meaningfully. Cameron's been providing some interesting context about the area's development. Something in Jack's tone suggested the conversation had been about more than historical curiosity. "Actually," Cameron said, lowering his voice, "I've been sharing some concerns about the current development strategy. The Preston approach to Harborside doesn't sit right with me. But as the junior member of the family business, my opinion carries little weight. I glanced around to ensure we weren't overheard. You know about the eviction notices delivered today? Cameron nodded grimly. The timing wasn't accidental. Bradley wanted to ensure any potential protests would be overshadowed by wedding coverage in the local press. The Harborside announcement is scheduled for his reception speech. That's unconscionable, I said, anger rising. Some of those businesses have been there for generations, which is precisely why they're being targeted first, Cameron explained. The historical significance of those properties is the main obstacle to the marina expansion. Once they're gone, the preservation argument weakens significantly. Jack placed a steadying hand on my back. Cameron's been providing documentation about how the building code violations were manufactured. It could be crucial for the business owners fighting the evictions. I looked at Cameron with new respect, recognizing the risk he was taking by opposing his family's plans. Why are you helping us? He seemed to consider his answer carefully. The Preston name used to stand for something more than profit at any cost. My grandfather built relationships. Bradley just leverages them. He shrugged. Also, your husband made some compelling arguments about sustainable development alternatives. Before I could ask what he meant, the announcement came for guests to move to the ballroom for the reception. Jack squeezed my hand. We'll continue this conversation later, he promised. For now, play your part. I need to make a few calls. As Jack stepped away with Cameron, I steeled myself for the reception. Victoria had made it clear that my role was to be the dutiful sister, graciously accepting my place in her shadow. For the first time, I wondered if I could continue playing that part when I knew what was at stake for the Harborside community. The grand ballroom of the Westbrook estate had been transformed into a vision of luxury, with crystal chandeliers reflected in mirrored table accents and centerpieces of imported white roses. I took my assigned seat at the head table, noticing that Jack had not yet appeared at his distant table 19. Victoria and Bradley made their entrance to enthusiastic applause, looking every bit the power couple they aspired to be. As dinner progressed, I found myself watching the room with new awareness, seeing beyond the surface glamour to the network of influence being leveraged. Mayor Wilson at table 3, laughing at Bradley's father's jokes. Commissioner Griffith Deep, in conversation with state senators at table 5. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a demonstration of the Preston family's reach. When Bradley rose for his speech, champagne flute in hand, the room quieted expectantly. Victoria and I want to thank you all for sharing in our special day, he began, his practiced charm on full display. But we're not just celebrating our union today. We're celebrating the future of Lakeside Harbor. A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. Tomorrow's newspaper will announce the Preston Waterfront Initiative, the largest private investment in our city's history, Bradley continued as servers discreetly distributed fresh champagne. With the full support of the City Council, we'll be transforming the outdated Harborside district into Lakeside Harbor's crown jewel, a world-class marina and luxury residential complex that will put our city on the map. Applause broke out, led enthusiastically by Victoria. I remained still, my hands folded in my lap, thinking of Maria Gonzalez and the eviction notice she'd received on what should have been a busy Saturday at her cafe. I'd like to recognize Mayor Wilson and Commissioner Griffith for their visionary support, Bradley added, raising his glass to the officials. Their partnership has been instrumental in clearing the regulatory path for progress. As the toast continued, I noticed movement at the ballroom entrance. Jack had returned, but he wasn't alone. Sophia stood beside him, along with Marcus and several people I recognized from Harborside businesses, including Maria herself. They weren't approaching. They were simply standing witness to Bradley's announcement. Victoria noticed them too. Her perfect smile faltered as she leaned to whisper something to Bradley, whose eyes narrowed slightly before he smoothly continued his speech. While change can sometimes be difficult, he acknowledged with practiced empathy, We believe this. Development will benefit all of Lakeside Harbor's residents. The Preston Foundation will be establishing a community fund to assist with transitions and preserve selected historical elements. From my seat, I could see Maria's face harden at the patronizing assurance. The community fund was a token gesture compared to the generations of livelihood being erased. Bradley raised his glass higher. To progress, to partnership, and to the future Mrs. Preston, who shares my vision for a better Lakeside Harbor. As applause erupted again, Victoria beamed triumphantly, the picture of a society bride whose wedding had doubled as a business coup. She caught my eye briefly, her expression shifting to one of warning as she noted my lack of enthusiasm. I felt a moment of clarity, sharp and decisive. The pattern of my relationship with Victoria, her orchestrated humiliations, my quiet acceptance, paralleled exactly what was happening to Harborside. The powerful writing the narrative, the vulnerable expected to accept it graciously. For once, I didn't look away from Victoria's challenging stare. Instead, I slowly, deliberately, placed my untouched champagne on the table and stood up. "Rachel," my mother whispered urgently, "what are you doing?" What was I doing? Breaking the script that had defined our relationship for decades, standing up not just for myself, but for a community that deserved better than to be collateral. Damage in the Preston family's ambitions. As if sensing my resolve, Jack moved forward from the entrance, walking purposefully toward the head table. The room quieted, attention shifting to this unexpected movement during what should have been a controlled celebration. Victoria's face flushed with anger. "Rachel, sit down," she hissed. "You're making a scene." But it wasn't me who was about to change the course of the evening. It was Jack, my deliberately ordinary-seeming husband who had spent years keeping his extraordinary success a carefully guarded secret. As he approached, Bradley extended his hand with the confident condescension he'd always shown toward Jack. "Glad you could join the celebration, Jack. I believe your table is toward the back." Jack shook Bradley's hand firmly. "Congratulations on the wedding, Bradley, and on your announcement. The Harborside initiative sounds impressive." "It's a visionary project," Bradley agreed, clearly eager to return to his moment of triumph. "It certainly is a vision," Jack replied, his voice carrying in the now quiet room. "Though perhaps not the only possible vision for Harborside's future." Bradley's smile tightened. "With all due respect, development strategy isn't really your area of expertise." "Actually," Jack said mildly, "community integrated development is precisely my expertise." He turned to address the room at large. "For those I haven't had the pleasure of meeting properly, I'm Jack Turner, founder and CEO of Horizon Technologies." The ripple of recognition was immediate. Horizon Technologies was known even to those outside the tech industry as one of the fastest-growing companies on the West Coast, recently valued at over $3 billion. Victoria's perfect composure slipped completely, her shock evident, as she looked between Jack and me with dawning comprehension. All these years, she had dismissed my husband as inconsequential, never bothering to look beyond his unassuming demeanor. "What's more relevant to tonight's announcement," Jack continued smoothly, "is that Horizon Technologies established the Lakeside Harbor Historical Trust 6 months ago. Through that trust, we've been quietly acquiring key properties throughout Harborside District, including the lighthouse and surrounding harborfront." Bradley's face had lost its color. "That's impossible. Our research showed those properties were owned by separate entities." "Shell companies," Jack confirmed, "a tactic I believe you're familiar with, though we employed it for preservation rather than demolition." The murmuring in the room grew louder as guests registered the public challenge to Bradley's announcement. "In fact," Jack went on, "as of yesterday, the trust owns controlling interest in 60% of the properties targeted by the Preston Waterfront Initiative, including all the businesses that received eviction notices this morning." He turned, to where Maria and the other Harborside representatives stood. Those notices have been rescinded, effective immediately. No one is being evicted from Harborside. The room erupted in confused conversation. Victoria gripped Bradley's arm, her expression thunderous as she glared at me. My mother looked between us all in complete bewilderment. "This is highly inappropriate," Bradley said tightly. "We're celebrating our wedding, not conducting business." "I couldn't agree more," Jack replied. "Which is why I found the timing of your eviction notices particularly distasteful. But since you chose to make your announcement tonight, it seemed only fair to clarify the actual ownership situation." He turned to me, extending his hand. "Rachel, I believe this might be a good time for us to say our goodbyes." As I stepped down from the head table to join my husband, Victoria finally found her voice. "You knew about this?" she demanded, her carefully constructed image of control crumbling. "You let me believe, you let everyone believe, that Jack was nobody important," I finished for her. "That was his choice, Vicky. He values privacy and genuine relationships, concepts I realize might be difficult for you to understand. And you chose today, my wedding day, to reveal this?" Her voice rose, drawing even more attention. "No, Victoria," I said calmly. "You chose today to announce the destruction of people's livelihoods and homes. Jack simply clarified that your plans won't be proceeding as announced." I turned to my mother, whose expression reflected the seismic shift occurring in her understanding of her daughters. "I'm sorry, Mom. We'll talk tomorrow." As Jack and I walked toward the exit, joining Sophia, Marcus, and the Harborside representatives, I felt Victoria's lifelong hold over me finally begin to loosen. The sister who had manipulated my place at her wedding, from the ill-fitting dress to the back row positioning to the separate seating from my husband, had just discovered that appearances can be deceiving. What none of us realized in that moment of revelation was that this was only the beginning. The confrontation at Victoria's wedding would spark a complete reimagining of Harborside's future, a legal battle that would expose decades of corrupt development practices and, most surprisingly, a path to healing the broken relationship between two sisters who had never truly seen each other clearly. Sometimes public humiliation is the precursor to private redemption. But that night, as we left the Westbrook estate behind, all I knew was that for the first time in my life, I was stepping out of Victoria's shadow and into a light of my own, making with a husband whose quiet strength had been there all along, waiting for me to claim my own. The morning after Victoria's wedding dawned with a strange sense of calm. I sat on our townhouse balcony, coffee warming my hands as I watched early sunlight glint off distant water. My phone had been switched off since we'd left the Westbrook estate, a deliberate choice to create space between myself and the inevitable fallout. Jack moved quietly behind me, setting down a plate of toast before resting his hands on my shoulders. "Ready to face the world?" he asked, his voice gentle. I leaned into his touch. "Not quite yet. Let's just have this moment." The previous night still felt dreamlike. The public revelation of Jack's true position, the shock on Victoria's face, the palpable shift in power I'd felt as we'd walked out of the reception. For my entire life, Victoria had controlled our narrative. In a single evening, that control had been irrevocably fractured. "Maria texted," Jack said, checking his own phone. "The Harborside business owners want to meet this afternoon. They're trying to make sense of what happened." Maria Gonzalez's family restaurant had been among the first Harborside businesses targeted with fraudulent code violations. The opening move in the Preston development strategy. I'd coordinated countless events at her waterfront cafe, drawn to its authenticity in a city increasingly dominated by corporate blandness. "I should check on my mother," I said, though the thought filled me with dread. Eleanor Morgan had spent decades mediating between her daughters, often sacrificing her own well-being to maintain fragile family peace. Last night's confrontation would have shattered her carefully maintained illusions. Jack settled into the chair beside me. Before we dive into damage control, I owe you an explanation. About secretly buying half of Harborside? I asked, a smile tugging at my lips despite the situation's gravity. I should have told you sooner, he acknowledged, his expression serious. When we first identified what the Prestons were doing, using building code violations and tax reassessments to force sales, I wanted to create a protective barrier around the neighborhood. The trust was the most efficient way to do it without alerting Preston Financial to the opposition. I studied my husband's face, recognizing both the strategic businessman and the compassionate community advocate I'd fallen in love with. Why, keep it from me? Jack's hesitation spoke volumes. Honestly, because of your relationship with Victoria. I wasn't sure how you'd respond to me actively working against your future brother-in-law's plans. The assessment stung precisely because it contained truth. I had spent years making excuses for Victoria's behavior, seeking her approval even as she systematically undermined my confidence. Would I have chosen her side out of ingrained habit? I'd like to think I would have stood with you, I said carefully. But I understand why you had doubts. I've never been very good at standing up to my sister. Until last night, Jack pointed out, squeezing my hand. That moment when you stood up at the table, that was all you, Rachel. I just provided backup. My phone pinged with incoming messages when I finally switched it on. 17 missed calls from Victoria, 5 from my mother, dozens of texts ranging from concerned to accusatory. I skimmed them, noting the progression of Victoria's emotions, from shock to anger to calculated damage control. The most recent message, sent just 30 minutes earlier, was more measured. We need to talk. Preston Foundation offices, 11 a.m. Family matters should be handled privately. V. She's already spinning the narrative, I observed, showing Jack the message. Victoria never wastes a crisis. She'll have developed a strategy by now. Are you going to meet her? I considered the question carefully. The old pattern would have been immediate compliance, rearranging my schedule to accommodate Victoria's demands. But something fundamental had shifted. Yes, I decided. But on my terms, not hers, and not at Preston Foundation headquarters where she holds all the power. Neutral ground. My mother answered on the first ring when I called, her voice thick with emotion. Rachel, thank goodness. Are you all right? Everything's been so confusing. I'm fine, Mom, I assured her. But we need to talk, all of us. Could you meet me at Seaside Cafe in Harborside at noon? Victoria too, if she's willing. Eleanor hesitated. Victoria's quite upset, darling. She and Bradley had a terrible argument after you left. She's staying with me rather than going on their honeymoon. The revelation that the perfect couple had skipped their Maldives getaway confirmed the magnitude of last night's disruption. All the more reason for us to talk, don't you think? This affects all of us. After some negotiation, Eleanor agreed to bring Victoria to the cafe. Jack kissed me goodbye as he left for an emergency meeting with his legal team. The trust's activities now publicly known and requiring immediate strategic planning. Want me to join you for the family summit? He offered. I shook my head. This first conversation needs to be just us Morgan women. Some reckonings are long overdue. Sophia arrived at our townhouse 20 minutes later, armed with legal documents and fierce loyalty. As both my best friend and an attorney specializing in housing rights, she straddled the personal and professional aspects of the unfolding situation. Have you seen the business section? She asked, handing me the morning paper as she entered. The headline was succinct. Preston Waterfront Project in Jeopardy. Horizon Technologies. CEO reveals controlling interest in targeted properties. A smaller article beneath noted, Society wedding becomes battleground for harbor development. Victoria must be livid, Sophia observed, settling on my couch. The Preston family hates nothing more than public embarrassment, which is why we need to be prepared, I replied, spreading out the documents Sophia had brought. Property records, the trust's holdings, evidence of the building code manipulation. They'll try to discredit Jack, Paint him as an opportunistic tech billionaire playing games with local development. Let them try, Sophia said with professional confidence. The paper trail of their intimidation tactics is extensive. Cameron Preston has provided internal emails confirming the coordinated pressure campaign. If this goes to court, the Prestons lose spectacularly. I traced the outline of the lighthouse on one of the property maps, thinking of the generations of Lakeside Harbor residents who had considered it community patrimony rather than development opportunity. It can't go to court, I said slowly, an alternative approach forming. Litigation would take years, during which harborside businesses would suffer from the uncertainty. We need a resolution that protects the neighborhood immediately. Sophia raised an eyebrow. You have something in mind? Maybe. I studied the ownership percentages Jack had acquired through the trust. The Prestons still control enough property to make development possible, just not their original grand vision. What if instead of fighting, we offered a partnership? A modified plan that preserves Harborside's character while allowing for some modernization? A compromise? Sophia looked skeptical. Do you really think Victoria and Bradley would accept anything less than total victory? I thought of Victoria's text, her immediate pivot to damage control. Victoria adapts when necessary. It's one of her talents. And Bradley is ultimately a businessman. He'll choose partial profit over complete loss. And you think you can negotiate this? Sophia asked carefully. The question touched on decades of power imbalance between my sister and me. Victoria had always been the one setting terms, making demands, controlling outcomes. I had been the peacemaker, the compromiser, the one who yielded. Not alone, I acknowledged. But I understand both sides in a way nobody else does. I know Victoria, I know the Harborside community, and now I have leverage I've never had before. Seaside Cafe occupied a prime corner of Harborside District, its windows offering panoramic views of the lighthouse and marina. Maria had preserved the building's 1920s character while updating its infrastructure, creating a space that honored heritage while remaining commercially viable. Exactly the balance the entire neighborhood needed to achieve. I arrived early, choosing a quiet corner table that would offer privacy for what promised to be a difficult conversation. Maria approached with a pot of coffee, her expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Your husband saved our businesses, she said as she poured. But everyone's wondering what happens next. The Prestons won't simply walk away from their plans. That's why I'm here, I explained, to try to find a path forward that protects Harborside without years of legal battles. Maria gestured toward the large windows. For 43 years, my family has served food with this view. My children grew up running between these tables. The Prestons see only real estate value, not community value. I understand both perspectives, I said, and that might be our best chance at resolution. The cafe door opened, and conversation momentarily ceased as Victoria entered, followed by our mother. My sister had exchanged her wedding glow for battle armor, a perfectly tailored suit, impeccable makeup concealing any evidence of post-wedding distress. Only someone who knew her well would recognize the slight tightness around her eyes as evidence of strain. Eleanor looked genuinely distressed, her gaze darting between her daughters as she approached the table. I stood to embrace her, noting how she seemed to have aged overnight. Thank you both for coming, I said, deliberately including Victoria in the appreciation despite her stony expression. Victoria remained standing, surveying the cafe with barely concealed disdain. I suggested we meet at the foundation offices for privacy. This is hardly appropriate for a family discussion. This isn't just a family discussion, I replied, evenly. The future of this neighborhood is intertwined with our personal situation now. I thought it made sense to meet where we can see what's actually at stake. Maria returned with additional coffee cups, her demeanor professionally cordial despite Victoria's obvious discomfort at being served by someone she'd been planning to displace. Mrs. Preston? Maria acknowledged with subtle emphasis on the new surname. Congratulations on your wedding. Victoria managed a tight smile. Thank you. Though the celebration was somewhat overshadowed by unexpected business complications. Once Maria had departed, Victoria leaned forward, her voice low and controlled. Do you have any idea what you and Jack have done? The investors. Who were counting on this development? The arrangements that were in place? You mean the illegal building code violations? I countered. The manufactured safety concerns? The coordination with city officials that borders on corruption? Eleanor gasped softly. Rachel, surely that's not… It's exactly what was happening, Mom, I said gently. Bradley's announcement confirmed it. They were using the wedding as cover for pushing through the final approvals. Victoria's expression remained impassive, but I knew her well enough to recognize when she was recalculating her approach. Business dealings are complex. There are standard practices in development that might seem questionable to outsiders. Forcing family businesses out of their locations through fraudulent safety violations isn't a standard practice, I replied. It's predatory and possibly criminal. And your husband's secret accumulation of properties through shell companies is somehow more ethical? Victoria challenged. I accepted the valid critique. Jack's methods weren't perfect, but his intention was protective rather than exploitative. Eleanor looked between us, bewilderment giving way to distress. I don't understand how we got here. Victoria, did you know what Bradley was planning for these businesses? For the first time, Victoria showed a flicker of discomfort. I knew about the development concept. The specifics of property acquisition weren't my concern. They should have been, I said quietly. Just like my dress at your wedding should have been your concern, or seating my husband with me. But people who don't matter to your narrative have always been invisible to you, Vicky. Victoria flinched at the childhood nickname and the directness of my assessment. That's unfair. I've been focused on building something significant, a merger of families that could elevate all of us. By hiding me in the back row of your photos? By altering my dress to ensure I looked worse than your friends? The accumulated hurt spilled out despite my intention to remain focused on Harborside. You've been pushing me into the background, our entire lives. Eleanor reached for both our hands across the table, her eyes swimming with tears. Please, girls, we're family. There must be a way through this. Victoria withdrew her hand, her composure slipping to reveal genuine hurt. I never thought you'd publicly humiliate me, Rachel. Whatever issues existed between us, exposing Bradley's business dealings at our wedding reception was cruel. The accusation landed with uncomfortable weight. Had our response been disproportionate? Had I participated in exactly the kind of public shaming Victoria had subjected me to for years? The eviction notices came first, I reminded her, though with less certainty. The announcement was planned regardless of our intervention. Which could have come the next day, Victoria insisted. Instead, you chose to stand aside while your secretly wealthy husband undermined everything in front of our entire social circle. My mother's distress deepened. I had no idea about any of this. Jack's company, the development problems, the tensions between you two. When did we stop talking to each other honestly? Her question cut through the accusations, exposing the deeper family dysfunction that had allowed the situation to escalate. How had we become so disconnected that major life circumstances remained hidden? How had Victoria's wedding become a battleground rather than a celebration? The cafe door opened again, admitting Bradley Preston himself, his usual confident stride, notably diminished. Victoria's expression shifted to one of surprise mingled with warning as he approached our table. I thought this was a family meeting, he said, directing his comment to Victoria rather than acknowledging my mother or me. It was supposed to be, Victoria replied, tension evident in her voice. Bradley turned to me, professional smile firmly in place despite the circumstances. Rachel, I was hoping for an opportunity to speak with Jack directly. This situation has escalated unnecessarily. Jack's in meetings with the trust's legal team, I replied. But I'm here, and I think we all want the same thing. A resolution that doesn't involve years of litigation. Bradley's smile tightened. What happened last night was unfortunate, and, frankly, a disproportionate response to standard business practices. If Jack wanted to discuss concerns about the development approach, there were appropriate channels. Like the appropriate channels you use to deliver eviction notices on wedding day, I asked. Victoria interjected before Bradley could respond. We're not here to escalate tensions. Rachel suggested this meeting to find a way forward. The shift in Victoria's approach, from confrontation to mediation, surprised me. It was uncharacteristic of her to surrender control of a narrative, particularly to me. Something had changed in the hours since her text message. I'm listening, Bradley said, pulling up a chair without waiting for invitation. I took a breath, organizing my thoughts. This unexpected moment of potential negotiation required clarity and precision, qualities I'd developed through years of event planning but rarely applied to family dynamics. Harborside needs investment, I began, acknowledging the legitimate business interest. Many of these buildings require infrastructure updates, and the waterfront has untapped potential. But the community value lies in its character and the families who've built their lives here. Bradley nodded cautiously. Those aren't incompatible goals. They are if your approach involves wholesale displacement, I countered. But what if there's a middle path? Jack's trust now controls enough property to block your original vision, but not enough to prevent any development. That creates an opportunity for partnership. Victoria watched me with newfound attention, professional interest overcoming personal grievance. What kind of partnership? A modified development plan, I proposed. One that preserves the historic waterfront, buildings while allowing for new construction in less sensitive areas, marine services that serve both existing community boats and new luxury vessels, housing that includes affordable options alongside high-end units. Bradley's expression remained skeptical. The return on investment would be significantly reduced. Initially, yes, I acknowledged. But you'd gain something potentially more valuable. A development model that bridges community preservation and progress. The Preston Foundation could pioneer an approach that other cities would study rather than protest. I could see Bradley performing mental calculations, weighing reduced immediate profits against longer-term reputation benefits. Victoria, however, was looking past the business implications. Why are you proposing compromise? She asked, genuine confusion in her voice. After last night, you and Jack hold most of the cards. Why not simply block our development entirely? The question revealed how fundamentally Victoria misunderstood my motivations, and perhaps always had. In her worldview, power was for leveraging advantage, not finding balance. Because this isn't about winning, Vicky. It's about the right outcome for everyone involved. I gestured toward the busy cafe around us. These businesses deserve security. The neighborhood deserves investment without erasure. And yes, developers deserve reasonable returns when they contribute actual value. Eleanor reached for my hand, unexpected pride in her expression. You've always seen all sides, Rachel, even as a child. Bradley exchanged a look with Victoria before responding. I'd need to see concrete proposals, financial projections, design concepts. The Preston board won't accept vague assurances of future value. Of course, I agreed. Jack's team has actually been developing alternative plans. For months, anticipating this conversation might eventually happen. They're prepared to share preliminary concepts as a starting point for discussion. Victoria studied me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something between suspicion and dawning respect. You've been planning this longer than I realized. No, I corrected her, Jack has been working to protect Harborside. I've been trying to maintain family peace at any cost, until I couldn't anymore. My sister flinched slightly at the honest assessment. Beyond her carefully maintained facade, I glimpsed vulnerability rarely exposed, the pressure of expectations, the fear of failure, perhaps even genuine regret. "I need to consult with our investors," Bradley said, standing abruptly. "They won't be pleased with significant modifications to the plan." "I understand," I replied. "But they'll be even less pleased with years of costly litigation and community protests that end with development completely blocked." After Bradley departed, an uncomfortable silence settled over our table. Eleanor looked between her daughters, decades of mediation habits visibly activating. "Victoria," she began cautiously, "perhaps there's wisdom in Rachel's approach, a chance to create something positive from this situation." Victoria's professional composure wavered, revealing a flash of the sister I remembered from childhood, before competition and performance had calcified into her permanent state. "You altered my dress," I said quietly, returning to the personal betrayal that had crystallized years of subtle undermining. "You deliberately made me look worse than everyone else in your bridal party." Victoria didn't immediately deny it, which itself represented an unprecedented shift. "The green was wrong with your coloring," she finally said, a partial admission rather than her usual deflection. "You could have chosen a different color from the beginning, or seated Jack with me, or included me in family photos without hiding me in the back row." My mother made a small sound of distress. "Victoria, did you really do those things intentionally?" Victoria met my gaze directly for perhaps the first time in years. "You've always been the one people naturally like," she said, the admission seeming to cost her considerable effort. "The authentic one, the one with real connections. I've had to calculate and strategize for everything I've achieved." The unexpected vulnerability momentarily silenced me. In all our years of complicated sisterhood, Victoria had never acknowledged perceiving any advantage on my side. "That doesn't justify humiliating me," I said eventually. "No," she agreed, with surprising directness. "It doesn't." Eleanor wiped away tears. "All these years I thought if I just loved you both enough, if I kept the peace, you'd find your way to true sisterhood." "We might still," I offered, not entirely convinced, but unwilling to extinguish the fragile hope in my mother's eyes. "Starting with finding a solution for Harborside that doesn't destroy either the community or the Preston investment." Victoria's phone chimed with an incoming message. She checked it, her expression shifting back to practiced neutrality. "Bradley's arranged a meeting with the investors for tomorrow morning. They're requesting financial projections for the alternative development concept. I'll have Jack send them over tonight," I promised. As Victoria gathered her belongings to leave, she hesitated. "For what it's worth, I didn't know about the eviction notices being delivered on our wedding day. That was Bradley's decision. Whether the claim was true or merely damage control was impossible to determine, but the olive branch, however small, represented progress." "And for what it's worth," I replied, "Jack and I never intended to disrupt your reception. If Bradley hadn't made the development announcement, we wouldn't have countered publicly." Victoria nodded once, accepting the parallel acknowledgement. "The Times is requesting interviews about what happened. The Preston PR team is advising a joint statement that frames this as a constructive business disagreement rather than a family schism." The strategic pivot was classic Victoria, controlling the narrative, minimizing personal aspects, redirecting toward professional resolution. Under normal circumstances, I would have simply agreed, falling into our established dynamic of her leading, me following. "I'll consider a joint statement," I said instead, "after we've made actual progress on the Harborside plan. Substance before spin. A flash of surprised respect crossed Victoria's features before she nodded and departed, our mother following after extracting promises from both of us to continue communication. As the cafe door closed behind them, Maria approached my table, coffee pot in hand. "Family is complicated," she observed, refilling my cup. "Almost as complicated as development politics." I smiled ruefully. "In this case, they're inextricably linked." "Your sister," Maria said carefully, "she has the look of someone who's built their identity on moving forward at any cost. I recognize it because my father was the same way, so focused on progress that he sometimes forgot what he was progressing toward." The insightful assessment of Victoria resonated with my own emerging understanding. My sister's relentless ambition had never allowed space for reflection on its purpose or cost. "Did your father ever change?" I asked. Maria smiled, the expression warming her entire face. "He did, eventually. After a heart attack forced him to stop working 70-hour weeks, he discovered he'd built a successful business but barely knew his family. It was terrifying for him realizing what he'd missed." She gestured toward a framed photograph behind the counter, showing an older man surrounded by children and grandchildren, all wearing seaside cafe aprons. "He spent his recovery time teaching his grandchildren to make his secret recipes. Said, it was more satisfying than any business deal he'd ever closed." As I left the cafe, I found Sophia waiting outside, her expression expectant. "How did it go with the Morgan women? Any bloodshed?" "Actually," I replied, "I think we might have taken the first step toward something like reconciliation, or at least a functional working relationship." Sophia linked her arm through mine as we walked along the harbor front, the historic lighthouse, standing sentinel over waters that had witnessed generations of community evolution. "And the development issue?" "Bradley's meeting with investors tomorrow. We'll need those alternative plans from Jack's team tonight." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of Jack, he asked me to give you this." She handed me a small velvet pouch. "Said it was important you have it before the community meeting this afternoon." Inside the pouch, I found the key to the lighthouse, a heavy, ornate brass piece that symbolized more than mere physical access. For generations, the lighthouse keeper had been selected by harborside residents, a tradition abandoned when the city had taken control of the property decades earlier. "The trust purchased it last month," Sophia explained. "Jack thought you should be the one to return the key to the community council." The weight of the key in my palm represented everything at stake: heritage, community governance, the delicate balance between preservation and progress. It also represented a profound shift in my own life, from someone who accommodated others' visions to someone helping shape a collective future. "Victoria will never fully understand why this matters so much," I said, closing my fingers around the key. "Maybe not," Sophia agreed. "But you do. And in this particular story, that might be enough." As we continued toward the community center, where harborside residents were gathering to discuss recent developments, I felt a curious lightness despite the challenges ahead. The confrontation at Victoria's wedding had forced truths into the open about family dynamics, about development ethics, about my own complicity in patterns that had diminished me. The path forward remained uncertain. Victoria and Bradley might reject compromise despite its obvious benefits. The investment group might demand concessions that threatened Harborside's character. My relationship with my sister might never evolve, beyond strategic cooperation. But for perhaps the first time in my adult life, I was walking toward conflict rather than avoiding it, equipped with both leverage and purpose. The lighthouse key in my pocket was not merely symbolic, it was transitional, marking the moment when I stopped being defined by Victoria's narrative and began co-creating a new one. The community center doors stood open, residents filling every available seat, their faces showing the mixture of concern and hope that characterized neighborhoods in transition. As I entered, Jack appeared at my side, slipping his hand into mine. "Ready?" he asked simply. I nodded, feeling the solid presence of the key in my pocket. Ready. The questions awaiting us were complex. How to honor heritage while enabling necessary change. How to balance business interests with community needs. How to transform opposition into partnership. But perhaps most challenging and most hopeful was the question that had emerged from that moment when I stood up at Victoria's wedding, refusing to play my assigned role any longer. How do we rewrite relationships defined by power imbalance into something more equitable and authentic? As Jack and I took our places at the front of the community gathering, I realized we were embarking on parallel journeys of reconstruction, one involving buildings and businesses, the other involving family bonds damaged by years of inequality. Neither would be simple or swift, but both were finally, undeniably underway. The community center hummed with anxious energy as residents filled every available chair, spilled against walls, and crowded doorways. I stood at the front beside Jack, the lighthouse key a reassuring weight in my pocket as I surveyed the faces before me. Shopkeepers, restaurateurs, artists, and families whose harborside roots stretched back generations. Their expressions ranged from hopeful to skeptical, united by a common uncertainty about their futures. "Thank you all for coming," Jack began, his voice calm but carrying easily through the converted warehouse space. "I know the past 24 hours have created considerable confusion about Harborside's future. We're here to provide clarity and, more importantly, to listen." Frank Williams, the 82-year-old owner of the Maritime Bookshop and unofficial neighborhood historian, raised his hand immediately. "What exactly happened at that wedding? The papers are saying different things, and we need to know where we stand." Jack looked to me, acknowledging that this particular explanation was mine to give. The personal and professional had become hopelessly entangled, our family drama now inextricable from community concerns. My brother-in-law, Bradley Preston, planned to announce the Harborside redevelopment at his wedding reception, I explained, choosing my words carefully. What he didn't know was that my husband had been quietly working to protect threatened properties through the Lakeside Harbor Historical Trust. Maria Gonzalez spoke up from the back. "Those eviction notices, were they even legal?" "They were procedurally legal but substantively fraudulent," Sophia answered, stepping forward with her attorney's precision. "The building code violations cited were manufactured through selective interpretation and strategic inspection timing. We've documented the pattern thoroughly." A murmur rippled through the crowd as this confirmation of suspected manipulation sank in. I watched their faces, recognizing the particular distress of people who had followed rules and maintained properties, only to be undermined by those with power to reinterpret those same rules. "So what happens now?" asked Eliza Chen, whose family's apothecary had occupied the same corner for 3 generations. "Are we safe? Or is this just a temporary reprieve?" Jack outlined the current ownership structure, the trust's controlling interest in key properties, the remaining parcels still under Preston control, the strategic importance of the lighthouse and surrounding harborfront. The technical details provided necessary context, but I could see the community needed something more personal, more grounding. "I've spoken with my sister and Bradley today," I added when Jack finished. "They've agreed to consider an alternative development approach that would preserve Harborside's character while allowing for necessary modernization." "And we should trust them after what they tried to pull?" Frank challenged, skepticism etched into his weathered features. It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself throughout the negotiations. Victoria and Bradley had demonstrated predatory tactics and casual disregard for community impacts. What assurance could we possibly offer that compromise wouldn't simply become delayed displacement? "You shouldn't trust blindly," I acknowledged. "Any agreement will have binding legal protections and community oversight. But fighting through years of litigation while Harborside remains in limbo serves no one." "Except lawyers," someone called out. generating scattered laughter that momentarily lightened the tension. Maria moved to the front, turning to address her neighbors rather than us. I've known Rachel for years through events at my cafe. She understands what makes Harborside special, because she's been bringing clients here when she could have chosen fancier venues downtown. If she believes negotiation is possible, I'm willing to listen. The simple vote of confidence created space for tentative hope. As community members began asking more specific questions about potential protections and compromises, I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. Cameron Preston stood just behind me, his expression both apologetic and resolute. "Could we speak privately?" he asked quietly. We stepped into a small office off the main meeting room, Jack joining us with a questioning glance. Cameron's presence at a community gathering represented a significant deviation from Preston family solidarity. "Bradley knows I'm here," he said, answering the unspoken question. "That's partly why I needed to speak with you urgently. The investor meeting tomorrow isn't what you think." "Explain," Jack said, his tone sharpening. "It's not about considering your compromise proposal. It's about developing a strategy to undermine the trust's position through regulatory challenges and political pressure." Cameron ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing genuine distress. "Bradley's already meeting with Mayor Wilson about emergency powers related to essential waterfront development. They're trying to find a legal way around your property ownership." The revelation shouldn't have surprised me. Victoria and Bradley would naturally leverage every available connection, but the speed and duplicity still landed like a physical blow. Our morning's tentative progress had been nothing but a delaying tactic. "Why are you telling us this?" I asked, studying Cameron closely. He met my gaze directly. "Because the Preston approach is increasingly at odds with why I went into development. I believed we were creating actual value, not just extracting it. This situation has forced me to recognize how far we've drifted from that ideal." "What exactly are they planning?" Jack asked. "The strategy has multiple fronts," Cameron explained. "They'll challenge the trust's acquisition methods, arguing they constitute anti-competitive practices. Simultaneously, they'll push for emergency rezoning based on critical infrastructure needs. The foundation will announce a generous relocation fund for displaced businesses while painting opposition as anti-progress." The comprehensive approach reflected Victoria's thorough preparation, a quality I'd always admired in my sister before understanding how it could be weaponized. "They're counting on public opinion shifting once they control the narrative," Cameron continued. "Bradley's already lined up endorsements from the Chamber of Commerce and 3 city council members." Jack absorbed this information with the measured calm I'd come to recognize as his strategic thinking mode. "The trust's legal position is sound, but public battles can complicate clean resolutions. We should prepare for multiple scenarios." I thought of Victoria's carefully constructed image, her lifelong talent for positioning herself as reasonable while making others appear difficult. She would excel at framing community preservation as backwards-looking obstruction. "We need to change the story," I said slowly, an alternative approach taking shape. "Not just respond to their narrative, but create a more compelling one." Both men looked at me expectantly. The Prestons are presenting this as a binary choice: luxury, development, or stagnation. But we can offer a third option that's more appealing than either extreme. I turned to Cameron. "You said you went into development to create value. What would a value-creating approach to Harborside actually look like?" Cameron considered the question seriously. "Integration rather than replacement. Preserving the historic waterfront while upgrading infrastructure. Creating spaces where existing businesses can thrive alongside new ones. Mixed housing that maintains neighborhood diversity." He shrugged. "Basically what you proposed this morning, but with serious commitment rather than delay tactics." "Then help us design it," I challenged. "Not as a counterproposal, but as the primary vision. one compelling enough to win public support despite the Preston resources aligned against it. Jack nodded slowly, recognizing the strategic shift. We've been playing defense, protecting properties, challenging violations, responding to their moves. It's time to present an affirmative vision persuasive enough to change the conversation entirely. Cameron hesitated, visibly weighing family loyalty against professional conviction. Bradley would consider this betrayal. Or you could frame it as saving the family from a potentially disastrous public battle, I suggested. The Prestons still own significant harborside property. They can either be junior partners in a successful integrated development or major opponents in a failed hostile takeover. Put that way, Cameron's expression shifted toward cautious agreement. We need to move quickly, Jack said. If they're already meeting with the mayor, we have limited time before the regulatory landscape changes. I glanced toward the meeting room where community members continued their earnest discussion. And we need to bring the neighborhood into the design process immediately. Their wisdom about this place is our greatest resource. When we returned to the main room, the conversation had evolved from anxious questioning to tentative planning. Maria had brought out large maps of the district, and residents were clustering around them, identifying critical preservation areas and potential improvement zones. Jack cleared his throat to regain attention. We've just received information that the Preston Group may be pursuing aggressive countermeasures despite this morning's discussions. We need to accelerate our planning process. The news was met with resigned nods rather than surprise, suggesting a community accustomed to powerful interests operating in bad faith. However, I added, we also have an unexpected ally. Gestured toward Cameron. Cameron Preston has development expertise and insider knowledge that could prove invaluable in designing a truly integrated plan for Harborside. Frank Williams studied Cameron suspiciously. A Preston helping save Harborside from the Prestons? That's quite a family disagreement. Cameron accepted the skepticism with grace. It's a professional disagreement as much as a family one. I believe development should enhance communities, not erase them. Fine words, Frank challenged. But your family's company has been trying to push us out for months. Why the sudden change of heart? It was a fair question that cut to the heart of trust. Something in short supply between developers and communities with reasons to be wary. Not sudden, Cameron corrected. I've expressed concerns internally about our approach to Harborside from the beginning. The difference is that now there's a viable alternative path, thanks to the trust's intervention. Maria intervened before the questioning could become confrontational. I suggest we focus on what matters most, protecting our neighborhood while creating a future we can all share in. If Mr. Preston wants to help with that, his insider knowledge is valuable. The pragmatic approach resonated with the gathered residents. Over the next hour, an impromptu planning session evolved, with community members identifying critical preservation needs, while Cameron and Jack outlined potential infrastructure improvements. Sophia documented everything, creating a framework for the formal proposal we would need to counter the Preston offensive. As the session concluded, I pulled Maria aside. We'll need a gathering place for ongoing planning, somewhere central to the neighborhood but private enough for strategic discussions. The cafe's back room is yours whenever you need it, she offered without hesitation. My family didn't keep this place for 4 decades just to surrender it to luxury condos. I squeezed her hand in gratitude, then moved toward Jack, who was deep in conversation with Sophia about legal preemption strategies. Before I could join them, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Eleanor. Rachel? My mother's voice sounded strained. You need to come to my house right away. Victoria's just received some troubling information about Jack's business practices. She's threatening to go public with it unless you both agree to meet. The vague accusation coupled with explicit threat was classic Victoria, creating leverage through innuendo and urgency. What kind of information? She wouldn't tell me details, Eleanor replied, her mediator instincts fully activated. But she seemed genuinely concerned, not just tactical. Please, Rachel, come talk to her before this escalates further. After disconnecting, I relayed the conversation to Jack, whose expression remained measured despite the implied accusation. Interesting timing, he observed, just as we're building community momentum. Do you have any idea what she might have found? I asked, studying his face. Nothing legitimate, he said with quiet confidence. But Victoria's resourceful. We should hear what she thinks she has. The drive to my mother's house passed in contemplative silence, Jack and I both processing the rapidly evolving situation. In less than 48 hours, carefully maintained boundaries between my family relationships and professional life had completely collapsed. Victoria, who had spent years dismissing my event planning business as trivial, was now engaging with me as a strategic opponent. Jack, whose deliberate privacy about his success had created space for authentic relationships, now stood exposed to public scrutiny. And I found myself navigating between worlds I'd previously kept separate, bringing my understanding of Victoria's tactics to community advocacy, applying my event planning diplomacy to development negotiations. Eleanor's house, a comfortable colonial in an established neighborhood, had been our family anchor since childhood. As we approached the front door, I felt the familiar pull of old patterns, the instinct to mollify Victoria, to accept her framing of situations, to prioritize peace over principle. Jack sensed my hesitation and squeezed my hand. Remember, this meeting is her idea, not ours. That already changes the dynamic. Victoria opened the door before we could knock, her expression a careful blank that nevertheless conveyed tension. She had changed from her earlier business attire into more casual clothes, but the effect remained calculated rather than relaxed. "Thank you for coming," she said with formal politeness, leading us to the living room where Eleanor waited anxiously. My mother rose immediately, embracing me with palpable relief. "I'm so glad you're both here. I'm sure whatever concerns have arisen can be addressed through calm discussion." Victoria didn't waste time on pleasantries. "My contacts at the Securities and Exchange Commission have flagged some concerning patterns in Horizon Technologies' property acquisitions," she stated, opening a folder on the coffee table, specifically regarding the timing of certain purchases relative to city planning announcements. The accusation's implication was clear: insider trading based on non-public information about municipal decisions. It was also completely unfounded. Jack's response was measured. "Your contacts appear to have provided incomplete information. The trust's acquisition timeline is fully documented and transparent. All purchases occurred after public filings." "Perhaps," Victoria acknowledged, sliding several documents toward us. "But these property transfers between Horizon subsidiaries create an interesting pattern that could certainly appear problematic to financial press." I studied the papers, recognizing the veiled threat beneath the concern. Victoria wasn't claiming actual illegality. She was identifying a narrative that could be spun to create damaging public perception. "This is what you threatened exposure over?" I asked, disappointment replacing apprehension. "A paper trail that shows normal corporate structure but could be misrepresented to suggest impropriety?" Victoria's expression hardened slightly. "Public opinion matters in these situations, Rachel. Perception can be as damaging as reality." The Preston Foundation has relationships with multiple financial publications that would find this information noteworthy. "You're threatening to plant misleading stories because you're losing on the merits," I translated, the familiar mix of admiration and frustration at Victoria's tactical approach washing over me. "I'm identifying potential complications that could be avoided through mutual cooperation," she corrected smoothly. Eleanor looked between us with growing distress. "Girls, please. Surely there's a solution that doesn't involve threatening each other's reputations." Jack gathered the documents, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. Victoria, may I ask what outcome you're actually seeking here? These documents don't support any legitimate complaint, so this approach seems unnecessarily antagonistic given our morning's productive conversation. Victoria hesitated, her usual certainty wavering briefly. The investor meeting didn't go as planned. Bradley's proposal for regulatory intervention was rejected as too risky given the trust's established legal position. This admission of setback was uncharacteristic of my sister, who typically projected unwavering confidence regardless of circumstances. Something had shifted in the Preston strategy. "So this is Plan B?" I asked. "Create public relations problems for Jack if you can't. Create legal ones? It's leverage," Victoria acknowledged with characteristic directness when her initial approach failed. "But it's also potentially an opportunity. The investors aren't enthusiastic about a protracted battle. They've authorized Bradley to explore genuine compromise options if we can establish acceptable parameters." I exchanged a glance with Jack, both of us recognizing the strategic opening. Victoria wasn't extending an olive branch from goodwill. She was making a calculated pivot when her preferred approach proved unviable. Yet the result might still be constructive. We convened community members this afternoon to begin designing an integrated development approach, Jack said. Cameron joined us and provided valuable insights. Victoria's expression flickered with genuine surprise. Cameron, he hadn't mentioned involvement. He believes there's a development model that serves both business interests and community. Preservation, I explained. Which is exactly what we discussed this morning before you and Bradley pivoted to regulatory manipulation. My direct naming of their tactics would once have been unthinkable, a violation of the careful dance Victoria and I had maintained for decades, where her maneuvers remained politely unacknowledged. The boundary crossing seemed to momentarily unbalance her. "The regulatory approach was Bradley's initiative, not mine," she said, a hairline crack appearing in the unified front they had presented. "I recommended continued negotiation." This subtle distancing from her husband's strategy was revealing. Victoria, always attuned to reputational dynamics, was hedging against potential blowback. "Then let's return to negotiation," Jack suggested, but with community representatives at the table from the beginning. No more decisions about Harborside without Harborside voices included. Victoria considered this, her strategic mind visibly calculating implications. Bradley won't agree to open community forums. The process would become unwieldy and potentially hostile given recent tensions. Not open forums, I clarified. A designated community council with real decision-making authority alongside Preston representatives and the trust. Structured, focused engagement rather than public spectacle. Eleanor, who had been listening intently, offered her first substantive contribution. A mediated process might help rebuild trust on all sides. The Community Foundation has facilitators, experienced in development disputes. The suggestion carried particular weight coming from our mother, who had spent decades mediating between her daughters without recognition or appreciation. Victoria's phone chimed with an incoming message. She checked it, her expression shifting subtly. Bradley's headed over. The investors have given conditional approval to explore an integrated development approach, provided appropriate financial safeguards and timeline commitments. Jack maintained his composure, but I recognized the slight tension in his posture at this news. The situation was evolving rapidly from confrontation toward potential collaboration, requiring adaptation from all parties. "Before Bradley arrives," I said, seizing the moment while Victoria was relatively receptive, "I'd like to address something beyond the development issue." My sister regarded me warily. If this is about wedding seating arrangements or bridesmaid, dresses now hardly seems the time. "It's about patterns," I clarified. "If we're going to work together on Harborside, which appears increasingly likely, we need to acknowledge the dynamic that's shaped our relationship for years." The one where you dismiss my perspectives until forced to consider them. Victoria's instinctive defense was visible in her posture, but to my surprise, she didn't immediately reject the observation. This isn't really the appropriate setting for personal grievances. It's exactly the appropriate setting, I countered. Mom has witnessed our relationship patterns for decades. Jack has experienced your dismissal firsthand. And now we're discussing a professional collaboration that will be undermined if you reflexively devalue input from me or community members you consider beneath your notice. Eleanor reached for both our hands, as she had at the cafe earlier. Rachel's right, Victoria. If you're going to work together effectively, some patterns need to change. The gentle support from our mother, who had historically avoided direct confrontation of Victoria's behavior, clearly surprised my sister. For a brief moment, her carefully constructed persona faltered, revealing a vulnerability rarely displayed. "I don't intentionally dismiss you," she said carefully. "We simply have different priorities and approaches. You altered my bridesmaid dress to make me look worse than your friends," I reminded her, keeping my tone even rather than accusatory. "You seated my husband at the farthest table from family. You positioned me in the back row of photos. Those were intentional choices, Vicky, not different priorities." Victoria glanced toward our mother, perhaps expecting the usual peacekeeping intervention. When Eleanor remained silent, something shifted in my sister's demeanor. "The wedding was," she began, then paused, seemingly struggling to frame her thoughts. "It represented something beyond just marriage. It was strategic, a statement about position and connections. Every element needed to reinforce that narrative." "Including making your sister look diminished by comparison?" Jack asked quietly. Victoria had the grace to look momentarily discomfited. "Image management requires difficult decisions." "That's not an apology or even an acknowledgement," I pointed out. "It's a justification for treating people as props in your personal branding exercise." "What exactly do you want from me, Rachel?" Victoria asked, frustration breaking through her composed exterior. "A tearful confession? Public penance? We're in the middle of negotiating a multi-million-dollar development compromise with significant professional implications for both of us. Does it really matter now if I was unkind about a dress?" "It matters," I said simply, "because it reflects how you approach relationships, including business relationships. If community partners are just props in your narrative, any compromise will eventually collapse into exploitation." Jack added his perspective carefully. "Successful integrated development requires genuine respect for all stakeholders. Without that foundation, even the best structural agreements eventually fail." The doorbell interrupted our exchange, signaling Bradley's arrival. Victoria stood, visibly relieved by the timely interruption. "We should focus on the practical negotiations now. Personal matters can be addressed later." As she moved to answer the door, Eleanor surprised me by speaking up firmly. "Victoria, your sister has raised valid concerns about patterns that could undermine this collaboration. Before Bradley joins us, I think you owe her at least an acknowledgement." The gentle but clear advocacy from our traditionally conflict-avoidant mother seemed to reach Victoria in a way my direct confrontation hadn't. She paused, her back to us, shoulders tense beneath her casually elegant sweater. "I was wrong about the dress," she said without turning around. "And the seating, and the photos. They were unnecessary cruelties motivated by my own insecurities, rather than strategic necessities." She took a breath. "I'm sorry." The simple admission, delivered without eye contact or elaboration, nonetheless represented a significant departure from Victoria's usual deflection or justification. Before I could respond, she continued to the door, admitting Bradley, whose confident stride faltered slightly as he registered the emotional tension in the room. "Have I interrupted something?" he asked, looking between Victoria's rigid posture and my undoubtedly surprised expression. Family matters, Victoria replied smoothly, professional composure sliding back into place. But relevant to our discussions since we'll potentially be working closely together on the revised Harborside approach. Bradley's skeptical glance suggested limited enthusiasm for this collaboration, but his response was diplomatically neutral. The investors have authorized exploratory discussions of an integrated development model with specific conditions regarding financial returns and timeline guarantees. Jack nodded, equally professional. The trust is prepared to engage constructively, provided community preservation and affordable housing components are non-negotiable elements. As the conversation shifted to development parameters and governance structures, I found myself watching Victoria with new attention. The momentary vulnerability, the brief, awkward acknowledgement of unnecessary cruelty, had revealed glimpses of a sister I barely recognized beneath the polished exterior. A Victoria capable of reflection and perhaps eventually genuine change. Whether that potential could manifest within the complex negotiations ahead remained uncertain. The interests at stake extended far beyond our sibling relationship, involving community futures, investor expectations, and competing visions of progress. Yet the small crack in Victoria's facade suggested possibilities beyond the rigid opposition that had defined both our personal history and the development dispute. As Bradley outlined investor requirements and Jack countered with community priorities, I found myself in the unfamiliar position of bridge builder rather than bystander. My understanding of both worlds, Victoria's status-conscious calculation and Harborside's authentic community value, created unique perspective that might help translate between competing viewpoints. What we need, I suggested during a pause in the increasingly technical exchange, is a structured process that builds legitimate trust while addressing practical requirements. Not just legal agreements, but relationship protocols that ensure all voices receive appropriate consideration. Bradley looked skeptical, but Victoria surprised me by nodding thoughtfully. Rachel has experience creating functioning relationships between disparate groups. Her event planning work frequently navigates competing priorities successfully. The unexpected acknowledgement of my professional capacity from the sister who had consistently diminished my career as mere party planning momentarily silenced me. Jack squeezed my hand in gentle encouragement. I'd propose a 3-phase process, I continued, finding my voice. First, a design charrette bringing together community representatives, Preston development experts, and the Trust's environmental consultants to create a shared vision. Second, a structured negotiation addressing financial requirements and preservation guarantees. Third, a community benefit agreement that legally codifies commitments from all parties. The framework was essentially an event plan scaled to neighborhood level, identifying stakeholder needs, creating appropriate structures for interaction, and ensuring outcomes reflected initial commitments. The skills I'd developed coordinating complex celebrations translated surprisingly well to development negotiation. Bradley raised practical objections about timeline and investor expectations, while Jack addressed technical questions about property rights and transition arrangements. Throughout the exchange, I noticed Victoria watching me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something between reassessment and reluctant respect. As the conversation concluded with tentative agreement to Eleanor's suggested mediation process, Victoria drew me aside while Jack and Bradley exchanged contact information. "Did you plan this?" she asked quietly. "Positioning yourself as the reasonable center between competing interests?" The question revealed how fundamentally Victoria viewed the world, as strategic positioning rather than authentic engagement. "No, Vicky. I didn't plan any of this, from your wedding revelation forward. I'm responding to circumstances as constructively as possible." She studied me with the assessing gaze I recognized from childhood, the one that had always made me feel measured and found wanting. But now, something had shifted in that appraisal. "You're good at this," she acknowledged, the admission seeming to surprise her. "The mediation role, the structured process design, It's unexpected. Only because you've never really seen my work, I replied without rancor. You decided years ago that event planning was trivial, so you never bothered to understand what it actually involves. Victoria absorbed this assessment with uncharacteristic receptiveness. Perhaps we've both been operating with outdated perceptions of each other. The tentative opening toward genuine connection felt simultaneously hopeful and fragile. Decades of established patterns wouldn't transform overnight, particularly amid complex professional negotiations carrying significant consequences for all involved. As Jack and I prepared to leave, Eleanor embraced me with tears in her eyes. "This is the first time you've truly stood your ground with Victoria," she whispered. "I'm so proud of you both for finding a way forward." My mother's validation touched something deep, a lifetime of seeking approval while navigating the complex dynamics of being the less favored daughter. Yet even this moment was evolving beyond old patterns, as I recognized that my choices no longer required external validation, even from Eleanor. "We'll see what happens," I said, returning her embrace. "The real work is just beginning." Outside, the evening had settled into that gentle harbor twilight that made Lakeside's water shimmer with reflected lights. Jack and I walked in companionable silence toward our car, both processing the day's rapid developments. "Victoria's apology surprised you," he observed eventually. "Completely," I admitted. "In 36 years, I've never heard her acknowledge causing harm without qualification or deflection." "People can change when their usual approaches stop working," Jack said thoughtfully. "The question is whether it's tactical adaptation or genuine growth." The distinction captured perfectly the uncertainty I felt about Victoria's unexpected moments of vulnerability. Was her acknowledgement merely strategic repositioning as she adjusted to altered power dynamics? Or was it possible that the confrontation had triggered authentic reflection? "I guess we'll find out during the harborside negotiations," I replied. "If she reverts to dismissing community perspectives the way she's always dismissed mine, we'll have our answer." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "The parallel tracks are remarkable. Your personal history with Victoria mirroring the potential exploitation of harborside, both involving someone with power deciding others' needs don't matter." The observation crystallized connections I'd been feeling intuitively. My lifetime of accommodating Victoria's dominance had paradoxically prepared me to recognize and challenge similar patterns in the development dispute. The very dynamics that had diminished me personally had created sensitivity to community vulnerability. As we drove home through Harborside's charming streets, passing the lighthouse now secure in trust ownership, I felt the weight of the key, still in my pocket, the physical symbol of heritage preserved rather than erased. Tomorrow would bring community consultations, mediator selection, and the beginning of formal negotiations with the Preston Group. The path forward remained uncertain, with powerful interests still seeking maximum advantage. Yet something fundamental had shifted in both the development process and my relationship with Victoria. Old patterns had been named, power imbalances acknowledged, alternative approaches proposed. Whether these changes would sustain through the complex negotiations ahead remained to be seen, but the possibility of transformation, both personal and community, felt newly tangible. The lighthouse beam swept across the harbor as it had for generations, guiding vessels safely to shore. In its steady rhythm lay the essence of what we were fighting to preserve, not just buildings or businesses, but the continuity that connected past to future through thoughtful stewardship of shared heritage. It was this deeper value that Victoria had always missed in her relentless forward focus, and that Bradley had dismissed as mere nostalgia impeding progress. But as Jack had demonstrated through the trust's intervention, preservation and progress need not be oppositional forces. With sufficient vision and genuine respect for all stakeholders, they could become complementary aspects of authentic community evolution. The coming weeks would test whether such integration was truly possible. or whether Harborside's future would devolve into the zero-sum contest the Prestons had initially envisioned. For tonight, however, I allowed myself to appreciate the small victories. A community mobilizing rather than surrendering, a sister acknowledging harm rather than justifying it, and my own voice finding strength in advocacy rather than accommodation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but the foundation for meeting them felt increasingly solid. The morning of the Harborside Community Festival dawned with perfect late summer clarity, sunlight dancing across the harbor water as vendors set up stalls along the newly renovated waterfront plaza. 6 months had passed since Victoria's wedding. 6 months of intense negotiation, detailed planning, and cautious relationship building that had transformed both a neighborhood's future and my understanding of what was possible with my sister. I adjusted a banner welcoming visitors to the festival while Jack coordinated with the technical team preparing the main stage for the afternoon's formal dedication ceremony. The event represented the public launch of the Integrated Harbor Initiative, the compromise development approach that had emerged from our contentious beginning. After months of skepticism from all sides, we had reached implementation phase, with genuine buy-in from community members, Preston investors, and city officials. The lighthouse tours are already booked solid, Maria reported, clipboard in hand as she joined me. Frank's got people lined up to hear about the restoration process. Who knew historical preservation could be such a crowd pleaser? I smiled at her enthusiasm. People connect with authentic stories. The lighthouse matters because it represents continuity rather than erasure. Exactly what our whole approach has been trying to achieve. Maria nodded thoughtfully. Speaking of achievements, have you seen the new community benefit agreement display? Sophia's team did an amazing job making legal protections actually understandable to regular people. We walked together toward the information pavilion where large illustrated panels explained the innovative structure we'd developed, binding agreements ensuring Harborside's character would be preserved while allowing for necessary modernization. The legal framework represented countless hours of negotiation between community representatives, Preston attorneys, and trust advisors, creating a model already. Yes, with Bradley and Dr. Bennett. They're bringing foundation board members to tour the demonstration project. I checked my watch. They should arrive for the ribbon-cutting ceremony around noon. My relationship with Victoria had evolved significantly during our months of professional collaboration, though not without occasional setbacks and complicated moments. The deep-rooted patterns of our sisterhood hadn't magically disappeared, but they had become more visible and therefore more manageable. Victoria still occasionally defaulted to dismissive impatience. I still sometimes withdrew rather than directly confronting difficult truths. But we were learning, imperfectly but genuinely, to create more balanced engagement. Sophia emerged from the information pavilion, legal documents tucked under her arm. The final permits just came through for Phase 2, she reported. City Planning Commission unanimously approved the mixed-use zoning accommodations. This official approval represented significant milestone, the regulatory framework that would allow preservation and development to proceed in carefully balanced measure. What had begun as confrontation at Victoria's wedding had evolved into a collaborative approach with broad stakeholder support. Any word on the grant application? I asked, referring to the federal historic preservation funding we'd applied for to support restoration of Harborside's most significant structures. Still pending, but Congressman Matthews seemed optimistic when I spoke with him yesterday. Sophia glanced toward the harbor entrance where tourist boats were beginning to arrive. This festival will certainly help demonstrate community engagement, a key criterion in the selection process. As festival attendees began filling the waterfront, I found myself watching for Victoria's arrival with both professional focus and personal anticipation. Our working relationship had created space for tentative personal reconnection as well. Though neither of us harbored illusions about transforming into stereotypical close sisters overnight, we were building something more authentic, a relationship based on actual understanding rather than obligatory performance of family bonds. Eleanor arrived shortly before noon, her proud smile encompassing both the neighborhood transformation and her daughter's evolving relationship. Our mother had blossomed during these months of repair, relieved of her lifelong mediator role as Victoria, and I learned to engage directly rather than through her buffer. "This is magnificent, Rachel," she said, taking in the festival atmosphere, with evident delight. "When I think about that terrible moment at Victoria's wedding, how it seemed like everything was falling apart, and now look at all this." I squeezed her hand, understanding the depth of emotion behind her words. "It's still complicated, Mom. The implementation phase will have plenty of challenges ahead. But you're facing them together," she pointed out. "Not perfectly, not without disagreement, but with genuine respect. That's all I've ever wanted for my girls." Jack joined us, greeting Eleanor warmly before updating me on logistics details. The Preston contingent just arrived at the east entrance, Cameron's showing them the renovated storefronts before bringing them to the main stage for the ceremony. I excused myself to check final preparations, finding Frank Williams already in position beside the ceremonial ribbon stretched across the lighthouse path. The elderly shopkeeper had become unlikely bridge builder between preservation advocates and development interests, his deep historical knowledge earning respect from even the most profit-focused investors. "Quite a turnout," Frank observed, nodding toward the growing crowd. "Never thought I'd see Preston developers and neighborhood activists celebrating together." "It's been quite a journey," I acknowledged. "Not finished by any means, but certainly not where we started." Frank's weathered face creased with a knowing smile. "Reminds me of you and your sister, still different as can be, but finding ways to work together that actually make sense." The observation was remarkably perceptive. Victoria and I remained fundamentally different in personality, priorities, and approach, but we had discovered potential complementarity in those differences, rather than merely opposition. Her strategic orientation balanced my relationship focus. My community awareness counterbalanced her institutional perspective. I spotted Victoria approaching with Bradley, Dr. Bennett, and several board members I recognized from previous negotiations. My sister had modified her appearance subtly but meaningfully in recent months. Her designer wardrobe now complemented by occasional heritage-inspired accessories, symbolic integration paralleling our development approach. "Rachel," she greeted me with professional warmth layered over genuine personal connection. "The festival looks impressive. Excellent turnout from community members and potential investors alike." "The integrated approach in action," I replied, accepting her brief embrace. "How was the storefront tour?" "Surprisingly effective," Bradley answered before Victoria could respond. "The heritage businesses with updated infrastructure are already showing increased customer engagement. The investors are cautiously optimistic about the model's commercial viability." This measured approval from previously skeptical financial backers represented significant progress. Bradley had evolved considerably from the developer who had announced displacement plans at his wedding reception, though his approach remained fundamentally business-focused rather than community-centered. Victoria examined the ceremonial setup with professional assessment. "The symbolism is well conceived, the lighthouse path representing connection between preservation and progress. Your event planning background shows in these conceptual touches." The straightforward recognition of my professional capabilities, without the dismissive qualification that had characterized Victoria's previous acknowledgments, reflected our evolving relationship. She was learning to recognize value in approaches different from her own, while I was becoming more comfortable claiming appropriate credit rather than minimizing my contributions. "We should take our positions," I noted as the gathered crowd began moving toward the ceremony area. "Mayor Wilson just arrived and the media is setting up near the stage." The formal program proceeded with carefully balanced representation. Community members sharing speaking time equally with development partners, preservation advocates alongside economic growth proponents. The integrated approach was reflected not just in content, but in structure, demonstrating genuine partnership rather than merely symbolic inclusion. When Victoria took the microphone for her portion of the presentation, I watched with both professional attention and personal curiosity. My sister had refined her public speaking approach during our months of collaboration, incorporating more authentic engagement alongside her polished delivery. The Preston Foundation's involvement with Harborside began with a fundamentally flawed premise, she acknowledged with surprising directness. We viewed this neighborhood primarily as real estate opportunity rather than as living community. That limited perspective would have created significant harm disguised as progress. The candid assessment of previous approach represented meaningful evolution in both Victoria's public positioning and personal reflection. She wasn't abandoning Preston interests, but she was incorporating broader considerations into how those interests were defined and pursued. Through genuine engagement with residents, business owners, and preservation advocates, she continued, we've discovered a development approach that creates authentic value for all stakeholders rather than merely extracting profit for select investors. This integrated model represents the future of sustainable urban evolution. As Victoria outlined specific elements of the implementation plan, I recognized how our professional collaboration had influenced her strategic thinking, just as her pragmatic approach had impacted my community advocacy. We had developed unlikely complementarity through months of challenging engagement, not erasing our differences but finding potential harmony within them. The ceremonial ribbon cutting featured Victoria and Frank together, representing institutional resources and community wisdom respectively, symbolizing the partnership approach at the core of our evolving model. As applause erupted from the gathered crowd, I caught my sister's eye across the ceremonial space, our shared glance acknowledging the journey from wedding confrontation to meaningful collaboration. The formal program transitioned to festival activities, with attendees dispersing to food stalls, information booths, and lighthouse tours. Victoria made her way toward me through the crowd, her expression reflecting professional satisfaction layered over more complex personal emotions. The investors are impressed, she reported, maintaining our public-facing professional interaction. The demonstration projects have addressed their primary concerns about financial viability. The board has authorized full funding for Phase 2 implementation. This approval represented crucial milestone for the neighborhood's future, transitioning from conceptual planning to actual construction, while maintaining community protections we'd carefully negotiated. The integrated approach had survived its first major practical test. That's excellent news, I acknowledged. The community council will be relieved. The uncertainty about investor commitment has caused considerable anxiety. Victoria nodded her understanding. The foundation will issue formal confirmation tomorrow, but you can share the approval informally with key stakeholders. This transparent information sharing, rather than strategic withholding for positional advantage, represented another evolutionary step in our working relationship. Victoria was recognizing the value of trust-building communication rather than merely transactional engagement. Mom would love to have lunch with both of us if you can spare the time, I suggested, transitioning to personal connection now that professional matters were addressed. She's got a table at Maria's Cafe with a view of the harbor. Victoria checked her schedule with characteristic attention to commitments. I can join for about 45 minutes before the investor tour. Bradley can handle the initial presentations without me. This willingness to create space for family connection despite professional demands reflected ongoing recalibration of Victoria's priorities. She wasn't abandoning her career focus, but she was making room for relationships previously subordinated to ambition. As we walked toward the cafe, weaving through festival attendees enjoying the revitalized waterfront, Victoria commented with unexpected reflection. Remember how I positioned you in the back row of my wedding photos? How I altered your dress to ensure you wouldn't draw attention? The direct reference to her previous manipulation surprised me. I remember. I was so concerned with controlling every element of perception, she continued, her tone contemplative rather than defensive. I couldn't risk anything authentic disrupting my carefully constructed narrative. And now? I prompted gently. Victoria gestured toward the festival surrounding us, the vibrant community engagement, the thoughtfully integrated design elements, the preservation of character alongside careful modernization. Now I'm recognizing that authentic integration actually creates something more valuable than perfect control ever could. The insight reflected genuine evolution in Victoria's approach, not abandoning her fundamental concern with outcomes, but reconsidering how those outcomes might be most effectively achieved. She was discovering potential strength in inclusive process rather than merely imposed vision. We're never going to be simple sisters, she acknowledged with characteristic directness. We're too different in fundamental ways. But I'm learning there might be value in that difference rather than merely competition. The assessment captured our evolving relationship with remarkable accuracy. We weren't transforming into stereotypical close sisters sharing everything and intuitively understanding each other. We were building something more authentic, a relationship that incorporated our genuine differences into functional connection rather than performative intimacy. Eleanor waved from a corner table as we approached the cafe, her expression reflecting deep contentment at seeing her daughters arriving together. Our mother had blossomed during these months of repair, finding new purpose beyond her traditional mediator role as Victoria and I learned to engage directly. "My girls," she greeted us warmly, embracing each in turn. Together at a community celebration rather than a wedding. Who could have imagined this outcome 6 months ago? Victoria smiled with uncharacteristic vulnerability. Certainly not. The bride who was busy orchestrating her perfect narrative without consideration for authentic relationships. The self-aware acknowledgement of previous priorities represented meaningful personal growth layered beneath Victoria's professional evolution. She wasn't becoming an entirely different person, but she was developing greater consciousness about her choices and their implications. Our lunch conversation flowed with surprising ease. Professional updates interspersed with personal observations, shared festival impressions alongside family recollections. The interaction wasn't without occasional tension or misalignment, but those moments no longer triggered either Victoria's dismissive control or my automatic accommodation. "I need to join Bradley for the investor tour," Victoria noted after, checking the time. "The foundation board members will expect detailed explanation of implementation timelines." As she prepared to leave, she surprised me with an unexpected observation. "You know, if someone had told me on my wedding day that Jack's revelation would ultimately lead to the most significant professional advancement of my career, I would have thought they were delusional." "Professional advancement?" I questioned, uncertain of her meaning. "The integrated development model we've created here is already generating interest from municipalities nationwide," Victoria explained. "The Preston Foundation is positioning itself as leader in sustainable community investment, rather than merely traditional development. It's opening doors that conventional approaches never could." The framing was characteristically Victoria, finding strategic advantage within ethical evolution, yet represented genuine progress nonetheless. She was discovering alignment between values and interests rather than treating them as inherently oppositional forces. "I'm glad something positive emerged from that wedding disaster," I offered with gentle humor. Victoria's expression shifted to rare, unguarded reflection. The wedding itself was the disaster, focusing so completely on appearance that I lost sight of substance. What happened afterward was actually necessary correction. This perspective, viewing the confrontation as valuable redirection rather than merely unfortunate disruption, suggested meaningful evolution in Victoria's self-understanding. She was developing capacity to recognize legitimate limitations in her previous approach, rather than merely defending established patterns. After Victoria departed to rejoin the investor tour, Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze my hand. 6 months ago, I couldn't have imagined this conversation happening. You both so comfortable in your differences rather than threatened by them. We're still figuring it out, I cautioned, maintaining realistic expectations despite genuine progress. Victoria hasn't magically transformed, and neither have I. We still trigger each other's defensive patterns sometimes. But you're building something real now, Eleanor observed with maternal insight. Not pretending to be closer than you? Are not performing sisterhood for appearance sake, but actually engaging with who you both truly are. Her assessment captured the authentic nature of our evolving relationship. Victoria and I weren't developing picture-perfect sisterhood, but something potentially more valuable, connection based on genuine understanding rather than idealized expectation. Jack found me as I left the cafe, his expression reflecting satisfied accomplishment as he surveyed the festival surrounding us. The Community Council just voted unanimously to proceed with Phase 2 planning. The demonstration projects have convinced even the skeptics that preservation and development can coexist productively. This community endorsement represented crucial validation of our approach, not just theoretical agreement, but practical support based on visible results. The integrated model was proving viable beyond conceptual appeal. Victoria confirmed investor approval as well, I shared. Full funding for the next implementation phase. Jack nodded with measured satisfaction. From wedding confrontation to community celebration in 6 months, not the outcome anyone anticipated that night. Especially not the sister who spent her life accommodating Victoria's dominance, I acknowledged, recognizing my own evolution alongside my sister's. Standing up rather than stepping back changed everything. For Harborside and for us. As we walked toward the main stage where afternoon performances were beginning, I reflected on how apparent endings had become unexpected beginnings. Victoria's perfect wedding, disrupted by Jack's revelation and my uncharacteristic resistance, had catalyzed both neighborhood transformation and relationship recalibration. My public humiliation in that ill-fitting bridesmaid dress had ultimately created opening for more authentic connection than decades of accommodation had ever achieved. The lighthouse beam swept across the harbor as it had for generations, now secured for community benefit rather than privatized for exclusive access. Its steady rhythm represented the continuity we had managed to preserve while embracing necessary change, heritage protected while enabling thoughtful evolution. My relationship with Victoria would never be simple or uncomplicated. The neighborhood's future would continue requiring vigilant balancing of preservation and development priorities. But both had crossed critical thresholds from destructive patterns toward potential reconstruction. Integration rather than erasure becoming the guiding principle for future growth. As the festival continued around us, I found myself experiencing genuine gratitude for that painful moment at Victoria's wedding, when I'd finally refused to remain complicitly quiet. Sometimes public confrontation becomes necessary catalyst for private transformation. Sometimes apparent catastrophe creates possibility previously unimagined. And sometimes, finding courage to stand in your truth changes everything, in family dynamics and community futures alike. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.